Hello, I'm Kelly McFarland, and this is Headlines in History from the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy, where we digest the most important updates from the world of diplomacy and foreign policy and take a short dive into one of the most pressing issues of the day. Today, we're going to take a deeper look at undersea cables, but before we get into that, let's take a look at some of the biggest foreign policy trends that have been going on in the past few weeks.
My friends, I want to talk to you today very simply about government.
I also believe that events in Iraq have reminded America of the need to use diplomacy.
This is not a time to undercut our diplomats.
And just a reminder, my new co-host, Tristen is going to be joining me again today. So Tristen, how's it going, man?
Very, very well. It's great to be with you again. Kelly, what do we have on the docket today?
All right, so as I briefly mentioned, I'm very excited to get into our deep dive, pun fully intended, a little bit later on, where we're going to talk about undersea cables and recent news about their vulnerabilities with Nick Thompson. But first, we're going to look at some of the recent developments in South Sudan, a political update on Canada, which we kind of teased a little bit a couple weeks ago. And then we're also going to chat a little bit more about Ukraine, which we also touched on a couple weeks ago, but obviously given the fluidity of events on the ground in Ukraine right now and the importance they have for just the regional order and international order in general, we're going to talk about that a little bit more.
Well, let's first get into South Sudan, where sadly the country is on the verge of a renewed full-blown war. Now, before we dive into recent events, I think it's probably useful to get some background down first. Of course, South Sudan is the world's newest officially recognized country. It declared independence from Sudan in 2011 following decades of civil war. When it separated, South Sudan had over 3/4 of former Sudan's oil reserves. However, just 2 years later, the country plunged into an ethnic-based civil war where the largest group, the Dinka, was supported by the country's national army, while the second largest group, the Nuer, formed militias. And both sides were responsible for widespread human rights abuses, including mass killings, sexual abuse, and the use of child soldiers. And from independence in 2011 to 2018, over 400,000 South Sudanese have been killed. In 2018, then, after 5 years of this brutal civil war, the two parties agreed on a ceasefire, and in 2020, the two main adversaries in the civil war formed a unity government. The truce between the president and the vice president and their respective ethnic groups looks increasingly shaky. While full-scale conflict was largely halted, low-level ethnic violence continued, with more than 7 million people, over half of the country's population, now facing acute food insecurity. So, Kelly, with that background, which is just so difficult to be reminded of, what's happening now with these latest tensions?
Yeah, so, when I talk about South Sudan, the first thing it reminds me of is just the level of attention that this got from the Obama administration back in 2013 when the Civil War broke out. I was a presidential daily briefing book backup briefer back in 2013 into 2014 before I ended up doing it for a year, and spent a lot of time, a lot of coverage on South Sudan, just because the U.S. had played such a major role in shepherding South Sudan towards independence and creating that new country that you talked about in 2011. So there was a lot of very interested players, a lot of buy-in from the U.S. on trying to bring that civil war to an end throughout 2013 to 2018. And it did come to an end, and there was a power sharing agreement between the two ethnic tribes that we talked about. But as with many of these post-colonial interstate conflicts that have been going on over the course of decades, whether it's in Asia or the Middle East or Africa, these ethnic tensions really make it difficult to tamp down. And there's such built-in, political patronage systems from each side flowing to their ethnic groups, so much of the corruption built into that kind of stuff. So it's really hard to actually get at those core problems and defeat them and rise above them, especially just in a few years. So what we're seeing is that South Sudan basically You've got the president, Salva Kiir, on one side, who is Dinka, the vice president, Riek Machar, who is Noor, on the other side. This was the truce, was the power sharing agreement. It looks like it's falling apart. And there hasn't been a lot of shifting to really integrate this into a workable unity government over the course of the past few years. And without those major systemic reforms, you really can't get beyond the things that they've been fighting over since 2013 and just were able to put on a truce for a while. But getting back to the present, what's really driving this is that in 2023, a full-scale civil war broke out in their northern neighbor, Sudan. And then in 2024, South Sudan lost 2/3 of its economic revenue when a main oil export pipeline was damaged in Sudan due to the fighting. So the resulting economic crisis has severely weakened the government in South Sudan, and they've been forced to work with Sudan's main rebel group, the Rapid Support Forces, or RSF, to reopen the pipeline. So in response, because the government in Juba, South Sudan, has been working with Sudan's main rebel group to open this pipeline because they control the area where it is, some analysts actually believe that Sudan's army has begun supplying weapons to the Nur ethnic militias in South Sudan. Kind of like, if you're arming my enemy, I'm going to arm your enemy, and just muddying the waters and making things more difficult. So recently, there's been a lot of pressure on both Kiir and Vice President Machar to kind of walk back from the precipice of a renewed major civil war. And in the last couple of weeks, the U.S. has removed all non-emergency personnel from the country. And that happened one day after an armed rebel group in the northeast of the country, which is kind of ungoverned and seeing conflict again right now, and near the border of Sudan, when this armed rebel group attacked a UN helicopter as the UN was attempting to evacuate some government soldiers. Some UN personnel died, a South Sudanese general died. So this is kind of ramping up things that are going on right now, creating food insecurity once again, and putting us on the precipice of another horrible civil war. Tristen, as you mentioned, 400,000 died from 2013 to 2018. And also just this region right now, when you look at Sudan, you look at potentially South Sudan again, you look at what's going on with Rwanda and DRC. I'm seeing potential stuff again in Tigray and Ethiopia as well. Just a lot going on in this region right now. All right. So now moving on to one of our wheelhouses, we are going to talk about Canadian politics. So we briefly mentioned on the last episode, we were talking about German politics, the recent upswing for the Liberal Party in Canada. And recently, they just selected a new prime minister. As we know, Justin Trudeau decided to step down. The Liberal Party voted in a new leader, and that is Mark Carney. And he is now the prime minister. He was sworn in last week. Carney was the first non-British person to become governor of the Bank of England, a position he held from 2008 to 2013. And before that, he served as the governor of the Bank of Canada. So, the Liberal Party is still facing pressures of growing inflation and a housing crisis and all these things. And it's a very difficult time to come into power because of that, but also, obviously, we have all read and heard about the US-Canada relationship and the historic low that it is at right now. But he also might have to be turning his attention to federal elections, which he may actually want to do sooner than later. So, yeah, Tristen, our resident Canadian, who's Carney, and what are the Liberals' prospects now compared to what they may have been 2.5 months ago?
Well, Mark Carney becomes Prime Minister of Canada at an unbelievably challenging moment. Exactly as you outline, the relationship between the United States and Canada, or perhaps more specifically between the White House and the Canadian government, is at an all-time low. And I think it's important to point out that, the relationship between Canadians and Americans is hopefully as cordial as ever, and yet we find ourselves in this moment where our governments are at a really profound impasse that is going to make life very, very difficult on both sides of the borders, but particularly for Canadians. So Mark Carney takes the premiership of Canada at this moment of crisis. But Mark Carney is somebody who's made for crisis. He is somebody who distinguished himself as a central bank governor in response to the global financial crisis in 2008, became the head of what was called the Financial Stability Board, which was the group that really steered us through the global financial crisis and ensured that things did not turn into a worldwide depression. In the years of attending G20 summits, as I've been doing over the past, 10, 15 years now, Mark Carney was without question one of the most impressive people that I encountered there. Year after year, he is unbelievable. If somebody can step up to a position of leadership in this really difficult moment for Canada, it's certainly someone like him. And what we see in the polls reflects that. If you and I were sitting here and having this conversation only a couple of months ago, we would be talking about how it was a foregone conclusion that the Liberals, the governing Liberals, would be wiped from power and the opposition Conservatives would take office under their leader, Pierre Poilievre. And yet, the so-called Trump effect on the Canadian opinion polls is absolutely astounding. I'm sitting with a poll published in the Canadian newspaper, the National Post, which is the conservative-leaning paper in Canada. And this poll that they published yesterday now shows that, and I'll read from it directly, 42% of Canadians plan to cast a ballot for Mark Carney, while 39% say that they intend to vote for the Conservatives. This is a radical, dramatic change of fortunes, wherein now not only are the Liberals leading, they might hang on here.
Yeah, it's crazy.
It is crazy. It is. I have never seen, certainly in Canadian political history, I've never seen a poll swing like this. I'm hard-pressed to think of a scenario anywhere where opinion polls have swung so far, so quickly.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking double-digit changes. It's not like they were down by 5 and now they're up by 3.
Yeah, in a matter of weeks.
Yeah, massively, massively down. So I want to follow up real quick because there's two sort of questions moving forward, right? What I'm reading about Carney and everything is, as you said, he's an impressive guy, impressive background. It seems to be saying and doing the right things right now, getting Canadians on board. What is the situation with elections? I know they've got to have them by the fall, but they could have them sooner. And the thought is that Carney should jump on this momentum and have elections as soon as possible. But then I'm also hearing the question remains what type of campaigner he's going to be as well. So what's the likelihood of an early election? And do you think he will be able to kind of step up?
So the strategic situation that Mark Carney faces is this. Canada has to go to the polls by October 2025. At the same time, Parliament, which presently isn't sitting, needs to resume by the end of this month. Now, Carney doesn't have a seat in the House of Commons, and so we're in this unusual situation where the Prime Minister of Canada is not in the legislature, and so, cannot personally be held accountable in the legislature. And so there's a lot of speculation that Carney will call the election before Parliament resumes and Canada will be in a federal election before the month is out. There's also potentially some strategic savvy in doing so. Canada is in the midst of this crisis caused by Trump's trade war, and the Liberals have risen to the top of the polls. Mark Carney has captured the premiership of the country on the back of this crisis, and so it seems more than likely now that he would succeed in a federal election in the midst of this crisis. So if I were placing money on this sort of thing, I would think that he'll make the call to go sooner rather than later. And then he'll be tested as a retail politician. This is somebody who is impressive in international summits and in central banks. But can this person campaign as a politician? And does this person also have the instincts of a successful politician? Is this somebody who's willing to roll the dice early and go for it? And this is no easy decision to make.
Yeah, but one we'll be keeping an eye on because it does have such a huge effect on the next few years in US Canada politics and the relationship and tariffs and trade and all the things. All right, so moving on to the latest in the Ukraine negotiations. We spent some time on this a couple weeks ago, but we're in this situation now where I think it warrants a little bit more discussion maybe every week that we have this podcast just to kind of keep people updated on what's going on. So it's March 18th right now for those listening that we're recording. And ceasefire negotiations have been underway between Russia and the US. Last week, Steve Witkoff, the US special envoy, met with President Putin in Moscow. He left without a deal. Not surprising, although Secretary of State Marco Rubio has claimed to be cautiously optimistic on the prospects for a deal. And the Ukrainians, you'll remember after chatting with the Americans, have agreed to a 30-day truce that was proposed in Saudi Arabia. Putin claims to be open to that, but hasn't officially signed on to that yet. Russia is still obviously demanding maximalist negotiating points and wants to maintain everything that it's gained since 2014, including Crimea, the Donbass, wants Ukrainian troops out of Kursk before it will sign this ceasefire agreement. So there's a lot going on at the moment, a lot of fluidity in all of this. It looks like Ukrainian forces are not doing very well in Kursk at the moment, the territory that they had taken and held inside of Russia last year. And to top it all off, Don and Vlad are on a phone conversation, perhaps as we speak. So that obviously will weigh heavily on this and is probably one reason Putin didn't sign on to anything yet, because of the fact that he wanted to be able to talk to President Trump and maybe persuade him a little bit more on certain things. So beyond just what's happening on the ground in Ukraine, obviously, Tristen, you and I have talked about this before and wanted to kind of focus on this here today too. But this, it's not just about Ukraine, what happens here. It's about the larger regional order and international order and what it says to those orders or the potential new orders about a country and state's ability to militarily take control of another country's territory. What that says for Israel moving forward, what that says for, we already mentioned Paul Kagame in Rwanda today, like what that means for them in DRC, in taking over certain areas and things like that, pushing past these norms that have been placed for 80 years. And it also puts immense pressure on Europe and America's historic allies in Europe to step up. So where's your head at with Ukraine at the moment?
Well, we can speculate wildly about the content of the phone call that at least the BBC has right now, that the phone call is happening as you and I speak. But what we do know is, irrespective of what comes out of that phone call, Europe is reinventing its security posture, and it has to. And the biggest, most important, most significant thing that has happened in the past days, and indeed as of this morning, was that the German parliament voted to change its debt limit, which allows for a massive infrastructure fund and, critically, an increase in defense spending. This is massive. The current German constitution limits the government to annual deficits of 0.35% of its GDP. And now Germany will be able to exceed that in order to increase defense spending. And it's important to remember, too, that, Germany has had a policy of pacifism, or at least relative pacifism, since the end of the Second World War. This is a fundamental shift for Germany, and beyond that, a fundamental shift for Europe.
Yeah, but one that has to happen. I mean, that's why it's so massive, as you mentioned. I think it was Schultz, the former chancellor, who was saying that they were going to raise percentage of GDP on defense spending to like 2.5 or 2.75%, which is really still not in the ballpark of where these European countries need to go. But if you did the numbers, that would be enough to cover the inflation on the salaries they already have for their military. So it's not like you're really doing anything to build out your military when you have those small increases. So this allows them, to go much higher. And if Europe is going to build a credible defensive deterrent against Russia, as you said, Germany has to be part of that. And I think I saw too, flipping it back to Carney, I think his first trip was yesterday to Britain and France.
You're absolutely right. The Canadian Prime Minister made his first trip abroad, and it wasn't, as is traditionally the case, to Washington. This time around, in very much a clear diplomatic performance, he stopped off in Iqaluit, which is in the north of Canada, and then to Paris, and then to London, sending a message that he is visiting, in his words, the three peoples who made Canada: the First Nations peoples, the people of France, and the people of Great Britain. The point here, much like in Europe, is to demonstrate that Canada, Europe, is able to go it alone with the United States. At least this is the diplomatic signaling and the sort of the cultural message that's being sent. Whether or not this is actually true or not remains to be seen. But this is where we are now, where countries and groups of countries are having to send very clear messages saying, okay, the US wants to fundamentally, radically change its foreign policy and retreat to an isolationism that has not been seen since before the Second World War. We will adjust to this new world order.
Or at least try. And
Or at
we'll
least
see. I
try.
mean, getting the debt break taken off and things like that are steps towards maybe being able to do that, but time will tell. And just speaking really quickly from a defensive deterrence standpoint, the things that the Europeans need to get better at are things that you can just flip a switch and get better at. It's intelligence capabilities, it's refueling capabilities, it's movement capabilities, all these things that take time to procure, but they seem to be moving in the right direction. So we will see. And I'm sure we'll have much more to talk about in 2 weeks after we've had time to digest the Putin Trump call and see where we are. All right, Tristen, thanks for joining me again today. Always a pleasure.
Thank you.
And for those of you on the edge of your seats, just know that the McFarland Nationals have started baseball practices, and it looks like I've got a pretty good squad. So yeah, we'll see what happens. I'll keep you guys posted as the season's a couple weeks away yet. But yeah, you'll be getting baseball scores and stats coming to you from the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy. So that ends our news roundup. Now we turn to our conversation with Nick Thompson about undersea cables. Nick is a former CIA paramilitary case officer and Naval Special Warfare Development Group operator. With over 20 years of experience in the national security space, Nick has conducted countless clandestine operations and combat deployments with a primary focus in the Middle East and Asia. He now works in Washington, D.C. at Anduril Industries, a leading defense technology company seeking to bring cutting-edge capability to intelligence and defense professionals. Let's listen into the conversation. All right, welcome back, everybody, to this week's edition of Headlines in History. And today we're going to dive into, actually, no pun intended, but we are going to dive into a topic that I've been following fairly closely for about a year or so, but that is the world of undersea cables. And we're going to explain to you folks that don't know much about undersea cables what exactly they are and why they've been in the news so much lately. And I'm excited to be joined today by Nick Thompson from Anduril Industries, who's going to walk us through this. Nick, thanks for joining us.
Kelly, yeah, thanks for having me. Pleasure.
All right, so let's just cut to the chase and get right to this on explaining to folks, when I say undersea cables, what exactly are they? Who owns them? And why should more people be aware of these things? Because they are pretty important.
Sure. Yeah, I totally understand. And I'll break it down at a very basic level. Long insulated cable, which lays on the seafloor and transmits data between countries. Why it matters is probably not that well understood, but it's the backbone of global internet TCOM networks, carrying over 90%, 95% of international data traffic. So that is a massive amount that, we depend on it every single day. A couple of industries that really use it the most or stand out for high impact would be the financial system, global markets, internet, and then you could even wrap, military and government transmissions in that as well.
So this is basically like, how we communicate, right? Like, especially across bodies of water. So, not so much of a big deal if you're in Washington, D.C., trying to talk to somebody in Chicago. But if I'm trying to send a WhatsApp message to my co-host Tristen in Cambridge, England, then it's more of an issue.
Yeah, so right now the undersea cables are the fastest, most reliable, and cost-effective way to share data.
Okay.
And hundreds of thousands, if not or into the millions, of laid undersea cable around the world, but connecting all continents everywhere.
You mentioned that they, at the moment, are the most effective way of doing this. So we're going to talk about that a little bit later. There's also oil and energy infrastructure down there as well, too, right?
Sure, there's a lot of things, we talk about undersea warfare, that can mean a lot. You obviously have the cables, which are a little bit dual purpose, but you have oil and gas, you have rare earth minerals, there's mining exploration, obviously very sensitive things with, submarines, unmanned systems, even debris fields when things fall into the water. There's a lot of interest there from governments and intelligence value.
Yeah, I mean, I find this such an interesting yet opaque topic because it's so important, but the vast majority of people never think about it, don't even know about it, but it's so intricately tied to our daily lives and our livelihoods and everything else. So the reason we're talking about this, not only to educate folks on undersea cables and systems, but also there's been reports in the past couple of years of an increase in cables being cut, pipelines being blown up, and some countries being accused of doing the cutting. So, can you walk us through maybe a couple of the more high profile instances of what's happened here?
Sure. So we've seen a high volume of incidents very recently, ever since I want to say Thanksgiving of last year. I think there's one on Christmas. Those were kind of the Baltic areas. Just last week, I want to say we had some Chinese vessels doing some suspect operations in and around India. So that's really brought these incidents to the forefront of open source news. But this area and how impactful it is has really been thriving since kind of like Cold War days. So for quite a long time.
Some of the biggest action is happening, and I know you were just quoted in a Wall Street Journal piece that focuses in on the Baltics. Why is that a key area right now, and how does that relate to who's being accused of some of this cutting?
So the Russians have a very capable program. It's commonly referred to as the GUGI program, but really stands for Main Directorate of Deep Sea Research. And they just poured a lot of money into that and their submarine fleet. So the Baltics, it's in their backyard. So, they're probing, they're harassing, but there's also an intelligence value. What are they doing to those cables? Because when you start talking about undersea cables, really the crown jewel is tapping those cables because of the high volume of data that's going through them. If you could tap into it and siphon off those transmissions, you probably have to decrypt it. You could be talking about very high impactful intelligence. And so they have a fleet of vessels. They're doing sanctions evasion too, but some of these deep sea research vessels, dual purpose, the Chinese do the same thing as well. But they're really, exploring, probing. A lot of it is casing too. That's an operational act, is getting
Right.
ready. So what
Yeah.
are they doing? Are they running sonar off the vessels? Or are those big, larger vessels launching smaller vessels, other submersibles, to take a look at different things undersea?
Yeah, right. In a way to sort of map it out. So if there was a conflict, they know where the cables are and then they can act quickly to mess things up for us. So walk me through, what does it entail if you want to cut a cable? Like, how do they do this? And how are they doing it in a way that makes it hard to pin it on somebody?
So cables do get damaged. They're, natural events undersea. There are, the whole anchor thing. We'll talk about that second. There are accidents that could damage cables. Now, the more specific incidents of what's happened with these, and I think these were the Baltic events. You had very large vessels, hundreds of feet long and wide, dragging anchors for long periods of 100 nautical miles. I don't really agree to the narrative of that was an accident. There's too many checks and balances in place on a ship. There is a log that records it. I mean, to drop an anchor accidentally, your speed is going to go down. There's going to be cavitation. It is very hard to say that this was an accident. I think there's even more reporting, or there is a high degree of confidence that some of these anchors or some of these systems have even been designed to actually cut, or they have some kind of cutting purposes. So That also leads to it's very difficult to prove this stuff. How do you actually have evidence of it? Are these countries letting the authorities investigate? And then on top of that, you might have a vessel owned out of a country, and then it's operated out of another country, and then you have a crew that's tends to be from the developing world. And so, like, what kind of prosecutor wants to take that on? Where exactly, in the maritime law, are we looking at territorial waters, generally 12 nautical miles? EEZ, economic exclusion zone, up to 200, and then after that, it's kind of, it's a little bit of high seas. So all of this leads to a very challenging environment to kind of like really understand what is happening, what's going on.
Yeah, and you mentioned the anchor stuff, and that's what's been in the news mostly. And I was just rereading some stuff on this morning before we talked, and the case of the Chinese vessel in the Baltic that had the anchor drop. It's like you said, you're going to notice if your anchor is dropped. I think they had to shut off their basically co-pilot because it was going too slow, and like the drag that's on it, and their automatic system was working. So this was obviously not an accident, like it couldn't have happened. But like you said, that's actually hard to prove. When you're not there, you don't see it. But you also mentioned, I think it was in the news, that the Chinese have actually developed something specifically for this.
And I haven't seen it, but I've heard that there's some engineering resources, some engineering horsepower that they've put into anchor systems that could actually help cut a cable. But, some of these vessels too that are doing this, they're old and they're not in the best shape. Because why? Because they might get seized. And so if they don't want some flagship vessel with the latest and greatest tech being seized, and then it's stuck, in red tape with the government.
Yeah, and it's also easier to say it was an accident if you've got some old clunker out there in the middle of the ocean. So that's cutting the cables, and the science. I mean, that's kind of, you drop an anchor, it drags across the floor and cuts a cable. Two follow-on questions. One, when we're talking these cables, this isn't like the 110-watt electric cable that's outside in your garage right now. Like, how big are these cables, thickness-wise? And then also, when you're trying to gather intelligence off of these cables, not cut it, I would imagine that's a much more delicate operation. What does that look like? Because the science of this really is fascinating to me, of like how somebody able to go hundreds of meters under the ocean and do that.
Yeah, and sometimes, Kelly, it's, thousands of meters.
Yeah.
But essentially, broadly speaking, you have a core fiber piece of a cable. That's the glass fibers and transmits data at light pulses. After that, you have a protection layer, plastic, steel, special coating to shield from salinity and the pressure. And then you have power conductors, copper or aluminum wires that supply power to the signal repeaters. So there are repeaters underwater that boost the signal. Those can also be used for penetration testing, like where is the problem?
Okay.
We'll send a pulse. If the repeater falls off, hey, that's kind of like where
That's
we're
where
going.
it's cut.
I would say cable tapping in advanced submarine operations, nuclear deterrence, some of the most highly sensitive things that governments and intelligence services conduct, right? There's submarines, there's autonomous vehicles, there's also ROVs, remotely operated vehicles. Some of those systems have dexterity. So undersea, you can actually do things.
Yeah.
So that is a very impactful intelligence operation.
So we think the Russians and Chinese might be doing this to some extent. So walk me through a little bit more on, because obviously we're not at war with Russia and China right now. And these countries that are being affected, while many of them may be NATO members, we're again not at war with Russia or China. So why are they trying to do this if they are doing it? And if there was a sort of act leading up to a war or during wartime where there was a massive amount of these cut, what is kind of a worst case scenario for us? Like, what would that look like on the ground for us, other than the fact that, like, I couldn't text somebody in France?
Sure. So, it's classic gray zone tactics. It's falling short of a U.S. service member doing a very overt or even clandestine operations, but it's probably short of a significant military or kinetic response. It's harassing, it's annoying, it's probing, it's probably casing, getting ready for if something was going to happen. They have a playbook already. The Chinese, if you Google Taiwan internet cuts, there's
Yeah.
like kind of like two articles that come up. Well, if you talk to people in Taiwan, it's actually happened like in the high teens or the low 20s. So it's happened quite a bit. But, it's China and Russia to the most extent, like really just, it's a harassing capability. Worst case is, a little bit doom and gloom, I might sound, but The financial system chaos would be very, very bad. The amount of trading, we're talking trillions of dollars a day in transactions, high frequency trading, stock markets. It would all delay and disrupt everything about trade. Payment system, the SWIFT
Yeah.
payment would be massively disrupted. That would also lead to supply chain paralysis. That would be a huge deal. But then also the loss of secure comms. And like, if the communication's encrypted, okay, that's great. But if we can't even communicate or send a basic message, the good guys could be on the back foot very, very quickly in some kind of armed conflict. And then there's always a risk of war and retaliation. What's a red line? Who's going to like, okay, this is annoying. This was a red line. Somebody's going to react very, very seriously. So there's a lot at stake.
Yeah, and that's the beauty, if you're Russia or China, of these gray zone tactics, right? Is that they can kind of get away with more than they would normally be able to because, there's deniability. It's not necessarily killing a NATO service member or attacking Taiwan. But if you're going to cut all the cables going to Taiwan and you're crippling their economy and their communications,
Yeah.
that could possibly get them to the negotiating table pretty quickly.
Yeah, yeah, wearing them down, right? Like
Yeah,
the Chinese maritime militia, very organized. They can all talk to each other. They're a little bit crude, rudimentary vessels, but they're in mass, so they pose a real threat. Or water cannons against the Philippine Navy or
yeah.
the South China Seas. Their claims in Nine Dash Line it's absurd, 90% of the South China Sea. So it's just one more tool in the toolbox where they're just constantly wearing people down. In the Taiwanese case, they never know, so they have to respond with launching sorties and vessels. And it's the same thing, even, we see around the world. You have to respond to it.
That's a good segue to my next question on how is the US, and I know NATO has stepped up things. So how are they working to secure these cables and try to stop this activity as best they can? And also one thing I wanted to ask too, because this adds to the somewhat difficult nature of who is supposed to respond, how to respond, but like these aren't necessarily owned by the government either, right?
Sure. So it's a difficult answer, and it's something that's pretty new and hasn't really been tackled. But to give you an example, very recently this year, Meta announced a $10 billion undersea project, 50,000 kilometers of undersea cable. So to protect that, just survey and inspection and make sure that critical infrastructure is okay is a huge effort. Same with there's a program called To Africa. That's a 45,000 kilometer project connecting 20 plus countries. So how do you protect that? Penetration testing, that's a good one. That's smart, but is it going to be a government led or is it going to be a privately led response? And the answer is probably a little bit of both. And so in the Baltics, we've actually seen warships shadowing the famous Russian vessel, the Yantar, that always pops up. But frankly, Coast Guards and navies have other more pressing requirements. It doesn't make sense to launch a frigate of 300 people or a battle group to make sure that these cables are intact. So I think we should be looking at more lean, efficient, fast-moving crew type vessels that can move quickly and then maybe launch unmanned surface vessel running ISR, reporting back. You could be using AUVs underwater, using that side scan sonar or multi-beam sonar to make sure that the cables are still intact. So ISR operations, whether it's above the water, below, what I mean by that is intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance operations, AUV operations, autonomous underwater vehicles. But you mentioned NATO, they created Task Force X. I believe it's led by a French admiral or general, but autonomous maritime dominance is kind of the mission statement of that. So I think that's moving in the right direction, but I just don't think that with the United States being stretched on multiple fronts, naval operations, there's probably going to have to be some reliance on unmanned systems to pick up the load just because there's so much cable in so many places.
All right. So last question, and this might be a short answer, but you mentioned early on that these are, sort of the most economical ways to transmit information still. Are there any other options? I know there's been talk about satellites, but they're not quite as good, right?
Sure. So, Kelly, you did mention too, like who owns these? Who
Oh
owns the
yeah.
cables? And a lot of times you have some of the biggest tech companies, the Amazons, the Microsofts, the Metas. You have the telecom companies, Verizon's, AT&T's. Those are just American. Then you also have a lot of foreign companies. But a lot of times for redundancy, or so there's some kind of backup plan, is that companies will not use one cable for everything. They'll diversify so they have a little bit of resiliency.
Okay.
But there is, if a cable gets cut, how do you reroute that data? And maybe how do you choose to actually prioritize which data is being rerouted, because if there's probably more important information for the military than, our WhatsApp messages.
Right.
And so there has been some early work on potentially rerouting to satellite-based low Earth orbit or GEO, for example. But to kind of put it in perspective, one undersea cable can transmit more data than all of Starlink combined. So
Wow.
in satellite-based comms, there's just going to be limited bandwidth, and there's going to be a little bit of higher latency. Now, that's probably it could still work for some backup scenarios, but it's probably not something to lean on so heavily as the undersea stuff. It's more cost effective. And then, you also have to deal with weather. There's a lot of different considerations in space as well.
Yeah. That's fascinating that it can transmit that much more information. That makes a lot more sense as to why we haven't moved towards that more quickly. I lied. I said that was my last question, but it's not. I think one final question that would also help put this in perspective is, when a cable is cut, how long are we talking to get it back up and running? Are we talking like days or months?
Well, to give you the former CIA guy answer, it depends. How quickly can a vessel get on station with an ROV? How deep is it?
Yeah.
What are the obstacles? I mean, it could be, weeks, it could be months. It just really, really depends. How deep is it? How hard is it to get to? Those are all factors that contribute to it.
And what's an ROV? I don't
I'm
even
sorry,
know.
remotely operated vehicle.
There we go.
So
Okay.
that would be something tethered with dexterity, like maybe it's got an arm, versus an AUV, fully autonomous underwater vehicle.
Okay. Got it. All right, Nick, this is a weedy subject, but fascinating subject. And I could talk about this for hours, but our listeners definitely don't want to listen to me talk about it. So anyways, thanks for joining us. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thanks again to Nick for his time and thoughts. And thank you for listening to this episode of Headlines in History. This show is produced by Freddie Mallinson and Theo Malhotra. Thank you to the Carnegie Corporation of New York for their support for this podcast. Be sure to check out any episodes you may have missed via our website. Please rate, review, and follow this podcast wherever you listen, and tell your friends and colleagues to come find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else they listen. Follow us on Twitter @GU Diplomacy and visit our website, isd.georgetown.edu, to learn more about our work. I'm Kelly McFarland. Until we meet again.